The letter arrived at the Times-Picayune newsroom on a humid March morning in 1919, written in flowing script that belied the madness within its words. The editor who first read it felt his blood run cold as he absorbed each calculated sentence. Esteemed mortal, it began. They have never caught me, and they never will. They have never seen me, for I am invisible, even as the ether that surrounds your earth. But it was what came next that would transform an entire city into a stage of terror and jazz. I am very fond of jazz music, the letter continued, and I swear by all the devils in the nether regions that every person shall be spared in whose home a jazz band is in full swing at the time I have just mentioned. If everyone has a jazz band going, well, then, so much the better for you people. One thing is certain, and that is that some of your people who do not jazz it will get the axe. The signature was unmistakable. The Axeman. New Orleans in 1919 was a city already intimately acquainted with death. The Great War had claimed thousands of its sons, while the Spanish flu pandemic had swept through its neighborhoods like a biblical plague. Yet nothing had prepared the Crescent City for the methodical terror that had been stalking its streets for nearly a year. The Axeman wasn't just another killer. He was something far more sinister, a phantom who moved through the night with surgical precision, leaving behind scenes of carnage that defied explanation. The letter's publication would mark a turning point in one of America's most bizarre and terrifying serial killing sprees. But to understand the true horror of what was about to unfold on March 19, 1919, we must first journey back to where it all began, to a sweltering night in May 1918, when the sound of splintering would first announce the arrival of evil in the Big Easy. If cases like this fascinate you, subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, where every mystery has a ticking timeline waiting to be uncovered. The Axeman's reign of terror would span 18 months, claiming at least 6 lives and terrorizing an entire metropolitan area. His victims were chosen with chilling deliberation. His methods were both brutal and inexplicably precise, and his ability to vanish without a trace made him seem almost supernatural to a city steeped in voodoo and mysticism. But perhaps most disturbing of all was his intimate knowledge of New Orleans itself, its rhythms, its people, and most unnervingly, its music. The killer seemed to understand that in a city where jazz was born, where music flowed through the streets like blood through veins, the threat to silence that music forever would strike deeper than any blade. As newspaper editors debated whether to publish the Axeman's letter, they grappled with an impossible choice. Would printing his words give a madman the attention he craved? Or would suppressing them deny the public crucial information that might save lives? The decision they made would transform a local crime story into a national sensation and create one of the most surreal nights in American criminal history. The clock was ticking toward March 19th, and across New Orleans, people were already reaching for their instruments, their voices, anything that could produce the sweet sounds of jazz. Because according to a killer who had never been seen, never been caught, and seemed to move through the city like smoke itself, music was the only thing standing between them and the axe. But who was this phantom killer? How had he managed to terrorize one of America's great cities while remaining completely invisible to law enforcement? And why had he chosen jazz, the very heartbeat of New Orleans culture, as both his obsession and his mercy? The answers lay buried in a trail of blood and broken wood that stretched across the city's neighborhoods, in police files filled with contradictions and dead ends, and in the collective memory of a community that would never again hear jazz music without remembering the night they played for their very lives. The attack on Joseph and Catherine Maggio should have been just another brutal crime in a city growing accustomed to violence. But as Detective Theodore Obit stood in the doorway of their grocery store on the corner of Uppaline and Magnolia Streets on the morning of May 23, 1918, he knew he was looking at something different, something that would haunt him for the rest of his career. The scene defied logic. Joseph Maggio lay sprawled across his bed, his skull crushed by repeated blows from his own axe. Beside him, Catherine's throat had been slashed so savagely that she was nearly decapitated. Blood had painted the walls in abstract patterns that spoke of unimaginable violence. Yet the most disturbing detail wasn't the brutality, it was the precision. The killer had entered through the back door, which showed clear evidence of careful panel removal. No crude breaking and entering here. Instead, Someone had methodically chiseled away at the wooden door until they could reach through and unlock it from the inside. The discarded axe belonged to the Maggios themselves, taken from their own shed and used against them with calculated efficiency. Nothing was stolen. Obitz noted in his report, his pen hesitating over the words that made no sense. The cash register remained untouched. Jewelry lay scattered but unmolested across Catherine's dresser. Even Joseph's wallet, containing nearly $40, a substantial sum in 1918, remained in his jacket pocket. This wasn't robbery. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was something else entirely. The investigation immediately focused on the couple's extended family, as such cases often do. Andrew Maggio, Joseph's brother, became the primary suspect when neighbors reported seeing him near the store that night. The grieving brother's explanations seemed rehearsed to some, suspicious to others. He claimed to have discovered the bodies, but couldn't adequately explain why he'd been in the neighborhood so early in the morning. But as days turned to weeks, the evidence against Andrew began to crumble. His alibi, while not perfect, held under scrutiny. More importantly, the methodical nature of the crime seemed beyond his capabilities or temperament. The Maggio family had operated their small grocery for years without incident. They were well liked in the neighborhood, involved in their church, and had no known enemies. Yet someone had targeted them with surgical precision, studying their habits, their routines, their vulnerabilities. Someone had spent considerable time preparing for this attack, gathering tools, planning the approach, ensuring escape routes. This level of premeditation suggested a mind both brilliant and utterly without conscience. The New Orleans Police Department, already stretched thin by wartime demands and the ongoing influenza crisis, found themselves grappling with a crime that defied their experience. Traditional investigative methods, following money trails, interviewing known associates, examining motives, led nowhere. The killer had left no fingerprints, no witnesses, no clear motive, and seemingly no connection to his victims. What they didn't know, as they filed away their reports and moved on to more solvable cases, was that the Maggio murders were not an isolated incident. They were an announcement, the opening chord in a symphony of terror that would crescendo over the next 18 months. 3 blocks away from the Maggio crime scene, other Italian grocers were beginning to take notice. The tight-knit community that had built New Orleans' vibrant food culture was starting to whisper among themselves. Was this random violence? Or was someone targeting their community specifically? The questions would soon become fears, and those fears would prove tragically prophetic. In the weeks following the Maggio murders, police received dozens of tips from concerned citizens. Strange figures lurking near Italian businesses. Suspicious individuals asking too many questions about store hours and security measures. Doors showing evidence of tampering. Each report was investigated and filed away, creating a paper trail that in hindsight would reveal a predator circling his prey with increasing confidence. But in May 1918, these were just isolated incidents in a city full of crime. The police had no way of knowing they were documenting the early reconnaissance missions of America's most elusive serial killer. The Axeman was learning his craft, perfecting his methods, and preparing for a reign of terror that would soon have an entire city sleeping with lights on and axes close at hand. The humid Louisiana summer of 1918 brought no relief from the terror that had settled over New Orleans like a suffocating shroud. On June 28th, just 5 weeks after the Maggio murders, the Axeman struck again, this time targeting Louis Bessumer and his common-law wife, Harriet Lowe, at their grocery store on Dorgenois Street. The pattern was becoming sickeningly familiar. The back door showed evidence of the same methodical panel removal. The victim's own axe, taken from their storage shed, had been used as the primary weapon. And once again, nothing of value had been stolen, despite the presence of cash and merchandise that would have made this a lucrative robbery. But this time, there was a survivor. Harriet Lowe, despite suffering severe head trauma from the axe attack, clung to life with a tenacity that would prove both blessing and curse for the investigation. When she finally regained consciousness weeks later, her testimony would add new layers of confusion to an already baffling case. It was a mulatto, she whispered through bandaged lips to Detective Obitz, who had rushed to her bedside the moment doctors declared her lucid enough to speak. The description sent shockwaves through the investigation team. A mulatto man would stand out in the Italian neighborhoods being targeted, would be remembered by witnesses, would leave traces that could be followed. But as the weeks passed and Lo's condition improved, her story began to change. Sometimes she remembered a white man. Other times, she couldn't remember the attacker at all. The trauma to her skull had affected her memory, doctors explained, but her shifting recollections raised uncomfortable questions about the reliability of the only eyewitness account they possessed. Meanwhile, Louis Besumer's survival added another puzzling element to the case. Unlike Joseph Maggio, who had died instantly from his wounds, Besumer lingered for weeks, drifting in and out of consciousness, mumbling fragments of memories that painted no clear picture of his attacker. His rambling statements, recorded by police stenographers, spoke of shadows and whispers, of someone who knew the way and moved like smoke through the house. The investigation took a bizarre turn when police discovered that Besumer, despite operating an Italian grocery, was actually German-born. In the paranoid atmosphere of wartime America, where German immigrants faced suspicion and sometimes violence, this revelation shifted attention away from the Axeman theory and toward possible espionage or sabotage. Federal agents arrived to question Besumer about his loyalty, his connections, his possible involvement in anti-American activities. This distraction would prove costly. While investigators pursued phantom German spies and interrogated bedridden victims about their patriotism, the real killer was preparing his next move. The Italian-American community in New Orleans was no longer whispering. They were shouting their fears to anyone who would listen. Giuseppe Romano, who operated a small grocery on St. Charles Avenue, had taken to sleeping with his father's old shotgun propped against his bedroom door. Maria Sciambra, whose family store anchored a busy intersection in the French Quarter, had hired her nephew to sleep in the back room as a guard. Their precautions would prove inadequate against a killer who seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to penetrate any defense. The newspapers, initially cautious about sensationalizing what could have been isolated incidents, began connecting the dots between the attacks. Headlines like "Axe Fiend Terrorizes Italian Quarter" and "Phantom Killer Stalks Grocers" appeared with increasing frequency, each article adding new layers of fear to an already traumatized community. Local jazz musicians, whose nightly performances provided soundtrack to the city's vibrant nightlife, began noticing changes in their audiences. People arrived earlier and left sooner, constantly glancing toward exits, jumping at unexpected sounds. The music that had always been New Orleans' healing balm seemed unable to soothe the collective anxiety that was spreading through the city like contagion. But the Axeman wasn't finished establishing his pattern. The attacks on the Maggios and Besumer had been experiments, tests of his methodology. Now, with confidence born of success and impunity, he was ready to escalate his campaign of terror to new levels of audacity and brutality. The next phase would prove that no precaution was sufficient, no neighborhood safe, and no victim profile reliable when facing a predator who seemed to understand his prey better than they understood themselves. The summer heat that had settled over New Orleans like a wet blanket did nothing to cool the terror gripping the city's Italian community. On August 5, 1918, as families across the Crescent City tried to find sleep despite the oppressive humidity, the Axeman was making his final preparations for what would become his most brazen attack yet. Edward Schneider should have been safe. Unlike the previous victims who lived above or behind their stores, Schneider resided in a quiet residential neighborhood on Elmira Street, far from the commercial districts where grocers plied their trade. His pregnant wife slept peacefully beside him, unaware that their back door was being methodically dismantled by hands that had perfected this sinister craft through repetition and refinement. The attack came with shocking swiftness. Mrs. Schneider awoke not to the sound of breaking wood, but to the whistle of an axe blade cutting through air toward her husband's skull. In the darkness, she could make out only a shadow, tall, lean, moving with practiced efficiency. The figure struck twice before Edward's cries pierced the night, sending the intruder fleeing back through the mutilated door from which he had emerged. He was like a ghost, Mrs. Schneider would later tell police, her hands trembling as she cradled her swollen belly. He made no sound except for the axe. Even his footsteps were silent, as if he floated above the floor. This time, however, the Axeman had made a critical miscalculation. Edward Schneider's skull, while cracked in 2 places, had not shattered like those of previous victims. The young man's survival provided investigators with their first coherent adult witness to the killer's methods, and what he described chilled them to the bone. He knew the house, Schneider told Detective Obitz from his hospital bed, his head wrapped in bandages that couldn't conceal the determination burning in his eyes. He moved through our home like he'd been there before, like he'd studied every room, every piece of furniture. He knew exactly where to find me in the dark. The implications were staggering. This wasn't random violence or crimes of opportunity. The Axeman was conducting surveillance, studying his victims' habits, mapping their homes, planning each attack with the precision of a military campaign. But how was he gathering this intelligence without being detected? How was he moving through neighborhoods unnoticed, despite the increased patrols and heightened vigilance that had followed the previous attacks? The answer came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Pauline Bruno, an elderly widow who lived 3 houses down from the Schneiders, approached police with information she had initially dismissed as unimportant. For weeks, she explained, she had noticed a man lurking in the alley behind her home, not threatening, just watching, always in the early evening when families were settling in for the night. He dressed like a workman, she told investigators, her voice barely above a whisper. Carried a toolbox, wore coveralls like he belonged there. I thought he was doing repairs for one of the neighbors. He was so ordinary. You wouldn't look twice at him on the street. This revelation transformed the investigation's understanding of their quarry. The Axeman wasn't a wild-eyed maniac striking at random. He was a methodical predator who could blend seamlessly into the urban landscape, using his unremarkable appearance and seemingly legitimate presence to conduct reconnaissance on his intended victims. Police began canvassing neighborhoods with new urgency, asking residents about workmen, repairmen, and anyone else who might have seemed out of place in the weeks before each attack. The responses painted a disturbing picture of a killer who had been hiding in plain sight, masquerading as the very people communities depended upon for security and maintenance. The pattern extended beyond mere surveillance. Examination of the crime scenes revealed that the Axeman possessed intimate knowledge of each family's routines. He struck the Maggios when their adult children were away visiting relatives. He attacked the Besumers during the 1 week each month when their neighbor, who usually checked on them nightly, was caring for her sick mother across town. He targeted the Schneiders on the evening they had dismissed their house guest early due to Edward's need for rest before a crucial business meeting. This level of intelligence gathering suggested either supernatural insight or a network of information that allowed the killer to monitor his victims' most private activities. The possibility of accomplices had been considered and dismissed in previous investigations, but the Schneider attack forced police to reconsider whether they were hunting a lone wolf or the leader of a more sophisticated operation. As August melted into September, the city's Italian community began implementing increasingly desperate security measures. Families moved sleeping areas away from doors and windows. Guard dogs became coveted commodities. Some grocers temporarily closed their businesses rather than risk becoming the next victims. But the Axeman's intelligence network, whatever its source, would soon prove capable of adapting to even these precautions. The autumn of 1918 brought a deceptive calm to New Orleans, as if the Axeman had vanished as mysteriously as he had appeared. September passed without incident, then October, then November. The Italian grocers who had lived in constant terror began to cautiously resume normal routines. Police patrols were reduced to focus on other pressing crimes. The newspapers moved on to covering the armistice that ended the Great War and the ongoing devastation of the Spanish flu pandemic. But on December 2nd, 1918, the illusion of safety was brutally shattered when investigators discovered the bodies of Mary and baby Rosie Cortimiglia in their small grocery on Gretna's West Bank. The scene that greeted Detective Obitz was beyond anything he had witnessed in his 23 years of police work. Mary Cortimiglia had died protecting her infant daughter, her body positioned as a shield over the child's crib. Both had suffered massive head trauma from their own family axe, wielded with a savagery that spoke of barely contained rage. Charles Cortimiglia, the husband and father, lay unconscious but alive in the adjoining room, his skull fractured but not fatal like so many before him. The back door showed the now familiar signs of methodical panel removal. Nothing had been stolen despite the presence of cash and valuable merchandise. The attack had occurred in the early morning hours when the family was most vulnerable. Every element matched the established pattern, except for one horrifying detail. The killer had murdered a baby. This escalation sent shockwaves through New Orleans that transcended ethnic and neighborhood boundaries. Previous attacks had targeted adult grocers and their spouses, victims who could theoretically defend themselves or escape. But baby Rosie Cortimiglia had been 18 months old, entirely helpless, posing no threat to anyone. Her death transformed the Axeman from a criminal into a monster in the public consciousness. When Charles Cortimiglia finally regained consciousness 3 weeks later, his testimony added a new dimension of horror to the case. Unlike previous survivors whose memories were fragmented by trauma, Charles recalled the attack with crystalline clarity that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He stood in the doorway watching us. Charles whispered to the assembled investigators, his voice hoarse from the throat injuries he had sustained. Not hiding, not rushing to attack, just watching, like he was enjoying the sight of our family sleeping peacefully. Then he smiled. I'll never forget that smile, and raised the axe above his head. The killer, according to Charles, had spoken during the attack. Not threats or demands, but casual observations delivered in a conversational tone that made them more terrifying than any screaming rage could have been. He said Mary was a beautiful mother. Charles continued, his hands shaking as he relived the nightmare. He told baby Rosie she would never have to worry about growing up in this cruel world. He spoke to them like he was doing them a favor, like he was saving them from some fate worse than death. This level of psychological sophistication suggested a killer whose motivations extended far beyond mere violence. The Axeman appeared to have developed a complex internal narrative that justified and even sanctified his actions. He wasn't simply murdering people. He was performing some sort of twisted ritual that made sense only within his diseased mind. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Charles Cortimiglia, despite having survived the attack and witnessed his family's slaughter, began pointing suspicion toward his neighbors, the Giordano family. Irlando Giordano, an elderly Italian immigrant, and his son Frank became the focus of Charles's accusations, despite having alibis and no apparent connection to the other Axeman attacks. The arrest and prosecution of the Giordanos would consume months of police resources and public attention while the real killer continued to roam free. Charles's accusations seemed motivated by old neighborhood grudges rather than actual evidence, but grief-stricken and traumatized, he clung to his story with desperate certainty. Meanwhile, the Axeman was preparing for his most audacious move yet, a direct communication with the city that would transform him from a local menace into a national sensation and create one of the most bizarre episodes in American criminal history. The letter that would arrive at the Times-Picayune newsroom in March 1919 was already being composed in the killer's careful script, each word chosen for maximum psychological impact. He had tested his methods, perfected his techniques, and studied his city's deepest fears and greatest loves. Now he was ready to play his ultimate card, the one that would turn New Orleans itself into his instrument of terror, using the very music that defined the city's soul as both weapon and salvation. The clock was ticking toward March 19th, and the Axeman was about to conduct his greatest performance yet. The letter published in the Times-Picayune on March 13th, 1919, transformed New Orleans from a city living in fear into a metropolis gripped by collective hysteria. Within hours of the morning edition hitting the streets, every music store in the French Quarter had sold out of instruments. Piano teachers found themselves booked solid for the next month. Jazz bands that hadn't performed together in years began frantically rehearsing in preparation for what the newspapers dubbed Jazz Night. But it was the letter's chilling specificity that truly terrified the city's residents. The Axeman hadn't merely threatened another attack, he had scheduled it with the precision of a concert promoter. March 19th, at exactly 12:15 a.m., he promised to pay a little visit to New Orleans, sparing only those homes where jazz music was playing at that precise moment. I am very fond of jazz music. The letter continued in its flowing script, and I swear by all the devils in the nether regions that every person shall be spared in whose home a jazz band is in full swing at the time I have just mentioned. The audacity was breathtaking. No serial killer in American history had ever issued such a public ultimatum, complete with a specific time and date for his next attack. The Axeman wasn't just terrorizing individual victims anymore. He was holding an entire city hostage to his twisted obsessions. Detective Theodore Obitz, now the unofficial expert on the Axeman case, studied the letter with growing unease. The handwriting was educated, flowing, suggesting someone with formal schooling. The language was sophisticated, almost literary in its construction. Most disturbing of all, the letter demonstrated an intimate understanding of New Orleans culture that went far beyond what an outsider could have gleaned from casual observation. "He knows us," Obitz confided to his partner as they prepared for what promised to be the longest night of their careers. "He understands how jazz flows through this city like blood through veins. He's not just threatening to kill people. He's threatening to silence the very thing that makes New Orleans what it is." As March 19th approached, the city began preparing for a night unlike any in its history. Police departments from 3 parishes coordinated the largest security operation ever mounted in Louisiana. Every available officer was placed on duty, with special attention focused on Italian neighborhoods and grocery stores. Military personnel on leave from nearby training facilities volunteered to assist with patrols. But the real preparation was happening in homes, bars, and community halls throughout the metropolitan area. Families who had never owned instruments scrounged up harmonicas, washboards, and pots to bang. Churches opened their doors for all-night jazz services. The famous red light district of Storyville, where jazz had been born, prepared for what some called the greatest concert in the music's brief history. Piano makers worked around the clock to meet demand. Music teachers gave crash courses to desperate families. Street musicians found themselves hired at premium rates to perform in private homes. The city's professional jazz musicians, many of whom had initially dismissed the Axeman's letter as a prank, began to appreciate the surreal honor of their art being chosen as the city's salvation. As evening fell on March 19, 1919, New Orleans began to transform into something unprecedented in human history, an entire city preparing to play for its life. The cacophony that rose from streets and houses as amateur musicians attempted jazz standards would have been comical under any other circumstances. But as the clock ticked toward 12:15 a.m., every discordant note carried the weight of life and death. The professional musicians who had made New Orleans the birthplace of jazz understood the deeper implications of what was happening. The Axemen had somehow intuited that jazz was more than mere entertainment in their city. It was identity, community, and soul made manifest in sound. By threatening to spare only those who played, he was forcing the city to prove its devotion to its own cultural heartbeat. King Oliver's Creole Jazz Band set up in Congo Square, the historic birthplace of New Orleans jazz, for a concert that would last until dawn. Jelly Roll Morton played piano in the lobby of the Roosevelt Hotel, surrounded by guests too terrified to sleep. In the French Quarter, brass bands marched through streets empty of everything except music and fear. As 12:15 a.m. approached, the volume of music throughout the city reached crescendo. Every home that could manage even the most rudimentary rhythm was producing sound. Police officers, stationed at strategic points throughout the city, reported an almost supernatural atmosphere as New Orleans became a single, massive, desperate orchestra. The Axemen had promised to visit that night, but would jazz music truly save the city, or had a killer simply found the perfect way to torment an entire population while he selected his victims from the few silent homes that remained? The answer would come with the dawn, when the city could finally stop playing and start counting the cost of dancing with the devil. The morning of March 20th, 1919, brought an eerie silence to New Orleans that felt more unsettling than the cacophony of the previous night. As exhausted musicians set down their instruments and weary families emerged from homes where they had played until their fingers bled, a collective question hung in the humid air. Had it worked? The answer came with the first police reports. No axe murders. No broken back doors. No Italian grocers found butchered in their beds. For the first time since May 1918, the Axemen had failed to keep a promise. The city that had played for its life appeared to have won a victory against an enemy who had seemed unstoppable. Detective Theodore Obitz walked the streets of the French Quarter at dawn, listening to the sounds of a city cautiously celebrating its survival. Jazz music still drifted from open windows where some families, too afraid to stop playing, continued their protective melodies. The sight of children sleeping peacefully while their parents maintained exhausted vigils over makeshift percussion instruments would haunt him for years to come. But Obit's relief was tempered by professional skepticism. Serial killers didn't simply honor bargains with their victims, no matter how public their promises. The Axeman's absence on March 19 suggested something more complex than mere adherence to his own twisted rules. Perhaps he had been deterred by the unprecedented police presence. Perhaps the letter itself had been his primary objective, the psychological terror of forcing an entire city to dance to his tune. Or perhaps he was simply waiting. The weeks following Jazz Night saw New Orleans attempting to return to normalcy, but the city had been fundamentally changed by its collective confrontation with evil. Jazz music, once simply entertainment and cultural expression, now carried the weight of salvation. Musicians found themselves treated like heroes, their art elevated from nightclub entertainment to civic necessity. Sheet music for the mysterious Axeman's Jazz began selling in stores throughout the South. Composers rushed to create new pieces celebrating the city's survival. The national press, which had initially covered the Axeman story as regional curiosity, now treated New Orleans as a symbol of American resilience in the face of unexplainable terror. But as spring turned to summer, the celebration began to feel premature. The Axeman's silence wasn't absence, it was patience. On August 10, 1919, nearly 5 months after Jazz Night, the killer returned with a vengeance that shattered any illusion that music had tamed his bloodlust. Steve Boca, a grocer on Elmira Street, awoke to the now familiar sound of splintering wood from his back door. But unlike previous victims, Boca was ready. The months of peace had not dulled his vigilance. They had given him time to prepare. As the intruder entered his home, axe in hand, Boca met him with a shotgun loaded with buckshot. The confrontation lasted only seconds, but its aftermath would provide investigators with their most detailed description yet of the Axeman's appearance. Boca, wounded but alive, described his attacker as a tall, thin man in dark clothing who moved with unusual grace despite his apparent age. Most significantly, the man had shown no surprise at encountering armed resistance. He had simply melted back into the darkness like he had never been there at all. He looked right at me when I raised the gun, Boca told police from his hospital bed, his voice steady despite the bandages covering his head wounds. No fear, no anger, just disappointment. Like I had broken some rule he thought I understood. The attack on Steve Boca proved that the Axeman's fixation with jazz had been temporary, possibly strategic rather than genuine. The killer was evolving, adapting his methods, testing new approaches to his deadly craft. The months of silence hadn't been retreat. They had been reconnaissance and refinement. More disturbing still, the Boca attack showed signs of escalation. Previous victims had been struck swiftly and left for dead. But Boca reported that his attacker had seemed prepared for a prolonged confrontation, carrying additional weapons and showing familiarity with the grocer's home layout that suggested extensive surveillance. The brief respite that had allowed New Orleans to believe it had defeated its demon was ending. As summer heat settled over the city once again, residents began to realize that Jazz Night had been merely an intermission in a performance that was far from over. The Axeman's greatest and most brutal finale was yet to come, and when it arrived, it would prove that no amount of preparation, no level of vigilance, and no protective power of music could guarantee safety from a killer who had transcended ordinary criminal behavior to become something approaching the supernatural in his ability to spread terror and evade justice. The autumn of 1919 found New Orleans in a state of cautious exhaustion. The attack on Steve Boca had shattered the illusion of safety that Jazz Night had provided, but months had passed without another incident. The city's Italian grocers had settled into a new reality of reinforced doors, guard dogs, and sleeping with weapons close at hand. Police patrols had resumed normal schedules. The newspapers had moved on to other stories. Mike Pepitone should have been safe. The successful grocer had taken every precaution imaginable after the Boca attack. His home on 2nd Street was fortress-like in its security preparations. Steel bars covered every window. Multiple locks secured each door. His 6 children had been sent to stay with relatives outside the city. Most importantly, Mike had convinced his brothers to take turns sleeping in the house as guards, ensuring that he would never face the Axeman alone. But on the night of October 27, 1919, Mike Pepitone was alone. His brother had been called away by a family emergency, leaving the grocer to face the darkness with only his own vigilance as protection. It would prove tragically insufficient against a killer who had spent months studying his routine and planning the perfect approach. The attack came at 4 a.m., during the deepest part of sleep, when human reflexes are slowest and defenses weakest. Unlike previous incidents, there was no sound of splintering wood to announce the intruder's arrival. The Axeman had learned from Steve Boca's resistance. This time, he entered silently through a window that had been left slightly open to combat the oppressive heat. Mrs. Pepitone, who lived next door, was awakened by sounds she would later describe as like a butcher at work, rhythmic, methodical, purposeful. By the time she could rouse neighbors and contact police, the damage was complete. Mike Pepitone lay dead in his bedroom, his skull crushed by multiple axe blows delivered with surgical precision. But this time, the killer had made a crucial mistake. As he fled through the same window he had used for entry, the Axeman was spotted by Mrs. Pepitone herself. Standing in her doorway, she watched a tall figure in dark clothing disappear into the shadows between houses. More significantly, she observed him removing what appeared to be gloves and stuffing them into a bag, evidence of premeditation and consciousness of guilt that previous crime scenes had lacked. He moved like a young man, she told Detective Obitz, her voice trembling with the realization of how close she had come to witnessing a double murder. Quick and smooth, but there was something wrong with the way he walked. Like he was hurt, or carrying something heavy. The crime scene told a story of escalating brutality that chilled even hardened investigators. Mike Pepitone had been struck at least a dozen times with his own axe, far more than necessary to cause death. The killer had continued attacking long after his victim was clearly deceased, suggesting either uncontrolled rage or ritualistic behavior that went beyond mere murder. Most disturbing of all, the killer had taken time after the murder to arrange Pepitone's body in a specific position, arms crossed, eyes closed, almost peaceful in death despite the violence that had preceded it. This post-mortem ritual was unprecedented in previous Axeman attacks and suggested that the killer's psychological state was deteriorating or evolving in dangerous new directions. The investigation that followed would prove to be both the most intensive and the most frustrating in New Orleans police history. Every lead was pursued with desperate thoroughness. Every witness was questioned repeatedly. The entire Italian community was placed under protective surveillance. Yet despite these efforts, the Axeman seemed to have vanished as completely as if he had never existed. What the investigators didn't know was that Mike Pepitone's murder would mark not just the end of the Axeman's New Orleans campaign, but potentially the beginning of a new chapter in a different city entirely. Within weeks of the murder, reports would surface from Los Angeles of a shooting that bore suspicious similarities to the methods and victims the Axeman had preferred. But those connections would only become apparent years later, when distance and time allowed pattern recognition that proximity and terror had obscured. In October 1919, New Orleans could only count its dead, tend to its survivors, and wonder whether the monster that had terrorized their city for nearly 2 years had finally moved on to other hunting grounds. The Pepitone murder scene would be the last crime definitively attributed to the Axeman of New Orleans. But the questions it raised about the killer's identity, methods, and ultimate fate would haunt investigators and true crime enthusiasts for more than a century to come. The investigation into Mike Pepitone's murder consumed the New Orleans Police Department with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Detective Theodore Obitz, now the city's leading expert on the Axeman case, found himself drowning in evidence that pointed everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. After 18 months of terror, the killer had finally made mistakes, but those mistakes only deepened the mystery of who he really was. The gloves that Mrs. Pepitone had seen the killer removing were never found, despite exhaustive searches of the neighborhood. However, investigators did discover something unprecedented in Axeman crimes: footprints. The soft earth beneath Pepitone's window had captured clear impressions of the killer's shoes, size 10 boots with a distinctive wear pattern that suggested someone who walked with a slight limp or favored his right foot. More intriguingly, the footprints showed evidence of the killer standing motionless outside Pepitone's window for an extended period before entering. Depth measurements suggested he had remained in position for at least 30 minutes, possibly longer, watching and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He's getting bolder, Obits noted in his case files, but also more ritualistic. This wasn't just murder, it was performance art for an audience of one. The break investigators had been hoping for came from an unexpected source. Joseph D'Antonio, a fruit vendor who worked the early morning markets, came forward with information he had initially dismissed as insignificant. On the morning of Pepitone's murder, around 3:30 a.m., he had observed a well-dressed man walking through the neighborhood carrying what appeared to be a doctor's bag. Nothing strange about that, D'Antonio explained to investigators. Doctors make house calls at all hours. But something about him bothered me. He was too clean, too perfectly dressed for someone who'd been roused from bed for an emergency. And he kept looking over his shoulder, like he expected to be followed. The description D'Antonio provided matched elements from previous witness accounts. Tall, thin, well-groomed, moving with purposeful confidence despite the early hour. But it also added new details that painted a picture of someone who could blend seamlessly into respectable society while carrying the tools of his deadly trade. This revelation prompted investigators to re-examine every aspect of the Axeman case through a new lens. What if the killer wasn't a shadowy outsider stalking Italian grocers from the margins of society? What if he was someone who moved freely through New Orleans' professional and social circles? Someone whose presence in any neighborhood would be unremarkable. The medical bag D'Antonio had observed suggested professional knowledge that could explain the Axeman's surgical precision in attacking victims. The killer's ability to disappear without trace might be less supernatural than previously believed. Simply the natural invisibility granted to doctors, lawyers, businessmen, and other professionals whose presence anywhere at any time could be easily explained. This theory led investigators down a series of fascinating, but ultimately fruitless paths. Medical records were examined for doctors with suspicious absences during the attack dates. Legal professionals who specialized in criminal defense were investigated for possible connections to the victims. Even newspaper reporters who had covered the case extensively found themselves under scrutiny for their intimate knowledge of crime scene details. But the most compelling suspect emerged from an entirely different direction. Frank Giordano, the young Italian immigrant who had been falsely accused and briefly imprisoned for the Cortimiglia murders, returned from his ordeal with information that would reshape the entire investigation. During his time in parish prison, Giordano had encountered a fellow inmate who claimed intimate knowledge of the Axeman's methods. This man, who gave his name only as Joe, described details of the crime scenes that had never been released to the public. More significantly, he spoke of the Axeman's motivations with a certainty that suggested either involvement or at least contact with the killer. He told me the Axeman wasn't killing for money or revenge, Giordano reported to police after his release. He said the killer was trying to prove something about the weakness of society, about how easy it was to terrorize people who thought they were safe. The jazz letter wasn't about music, it was about control. He wanted to see if he could make an entire city dance to his tune. Joe's insights proved remarkably accurate when compared to behavioral profiles that modern criminal psychology would later develop for serial killers. But when investigators tried to locate him for questioning, they discovered that no inmate matching his description had been processed through the prison system. The man had appeared and disappeared as mysteriously as the Axeman himself. As 1919 drew to a close without another attack, investigators began to consider the possibility that their quarry had either died, been imprisoned for other crimes, or simply moved to new hunting grounds. The pattern of escalating violence followed by sudden cessation suggested a killer whose circumstances had dramatically changed. The answer to this puzzle would emerge not from New Orleans, but from a courtroom in Los Angeles, where events were unfolding that would provide the most shocking possible resolution to the Axeman mystery. On December 2, 1920, exactly 2 years after the brutal murder of Mary and baby Rosie Cortimiglia, a woman walked into a Los Angeles courtroom that would forever change how the world understood the Axeman of New Orleans. Her name was Esther Albano, and she was on trial for the murder of Joseph Mumford, a man she claimed had destroyed her family in ways that law enforcement had never fully comprehended. The story Esther told the stunned courtroom connected threads that investigators had never thought to weave together. Joseph Mumford, she testified, had been the leader of a Black Hand extortion ring that terrorized Italian-American communities throughout the South. But unlike typical extortionists who demanded money for protection, Mumford's operation had been far more sophisticated and infinitely more deadly. According to Esther's testimony, Mumford had discovered that fear was more profitable than mere financial extortion. By creating an atmosphere of supernatural terror, a phantom killer who could strike anyone, anywhere, anytime, his organization could control entire neighborhoods without the messy complications of individual negotiations or payment schedules. He told me the Axeman was his masterpiece, Esther said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of her revelations. Not one killer, but the idea of one killer. Sometimes it was him, sometimes his associates, but always following the same patterns so people would believe it was one unstoppable monster. The timeline Esther provided matched the Axeman's activities with disturbing precision. Mumford had been in New Orleans during every major attack from May 1918 through October 1919. He had been arrested in Los Angeles on unrelated charges just days after Mike Pepitone's murder, which explained the sudden cessation of attacks. Most damning of all, Esther possessed intimate knowledge of crime scene details that had never been made public. But it was Esther's personal connection to the case that provided the most shocking revelation of all. She was Mike Pepitone's widow, though she had remarried and taken her new husband's name after fleeing New Orleans in the aftermath of her first husband's murder. I followed him here, she told the court, referring to Mumford. I spent months tracking him, learning his habits, waiting for the right moment. He killed my husband, terrorized my children, destroyed my community. The law couldn't touch him because no one could prove he was the Axeman. So I became the law. The shooting of Joseph Mumford had been execution-style, professional in its efficiency. Esther had waited outside his Los Angeles apartment until he returned from work, then shot him 5 times with a .38 caliber revolver. She made no attempt to flee or conceal her identity, instead waiting calmly for police to arrive. Her trial became a national sensation, not just for the shocking resolution it provided to the Axeman mystery, but for the questions it raised about justice, vigilantism, and the lengths to which ordinary people could be driven by extraordinary circumstances. Esther Albano had transformed herself from victim to avenger, and public opinion was overwhelmingly on her side. The evidence supporting her claims was compelling but circumstantial. Mumford's criminal record showed arrests for extortion, assault, and weapons charges in multiple states, always targeting Italian-American communities. Witness testimony placed him in New Orleans during the time periods when Axeman attacks occurred. His associates, when questioned, provided alibis that were demonstrably false or contradictory. Most convincingly, the attacks had stopped completely after Mumford's Los Angeles arrest, suggesting that either he had been the sole perpetrator or the mastermind whose removal had ended the operation entirely. But questions remained that Esther's testimony couldn't fully answer. The Jazz letter's sophisticated psychological manipulation suggested an intellect beyond what Mumford's criminal record indicated. The killer's intimate knowledge of New Orleans culture seemed to require deeper roots than a visiting extortionist could have developed. And the ritualistic elements of the later attacks implied personal pathology rather than criminal pragmatism. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a verdict of not guilty by reason of justifiable homicide. Esther Albano walked free from the Los Angeles courtroom. Her personal war against the Axeman finally concluded. The crowd that had gathered outside the courthouse erupted in celebration, treating her not as a killer, but as a hero who had accomplished what law enforcement could not. But for Detective Theodore Obitz, following the trial from New Orleans, Esther's revelations raised as many questions as they answered. Had Joseph Mumford truly been the Axeman, or simply one member of a larger criminal organization? Were there other victims in other cities who had never connected their tragedies to the New Orleans case? And most haunting of all, were there other Esther Albanos out there, pursuing their own private vengeance against criminals who had escaped official justice? The case that had terrorized New Orleans for 18 months officially closed with Mumford's death, but the questions it raised about crime, punishment, and the nature of evil would echo through American culture for generations to come. The city that had danced for its life on Jazz Night could finally stop playing, but the music of that desperate performance would never entirely fade from memory. In the end, the Axeman of New Orleans had achieved a form of immortality that his victims had been denied, not as a person, but as a symbol of the inexplicable terror that can emerge from the shadows of any city, in any era, reminding us that civilization's greatest protection against chaos is often nothing more than a thin veneer of sound and light. Jazz music played against the darkness. What's your take on this case? Was Esther Albano a hero or a vigilante? Did Joseph Mumford truly mastermind the Axeman's reign of terror, or was he simply a convenient scapegoat for crimes that remain unsolved to this day? Share your thoughts below and subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, because the next mystery is already ticking.